All right. It appears that the recording has started, so we will go ahead and begin the presentation. This is a slide you all are very familiar with, I think, at this point, but it is the representation of the DNA services we provide here for the Oregon State Police. We have the DNA analysis section here in the Portland Laboratory in Clackamas, and we do all the DNA analysis for agencies statewide. Our current staff consists of a section supervisor, Stephanie Winter-Sermeno, a lead worker. This is someone serving as a second supervisor for the section. The technical leader, that's me. My job is to oversee the technical and quality assurance operations of the section. But CODIS administrator, her name is Jamie Schroeder. She is responsible for the oversight of the CODIS program. We have an admin support specialist. Her name is Erin Nelson. Many of you have likely interacted with her. We have one databasing analyst. This analyst is responsible for populating the Oregon State Police database with convicted offender samples. We do have one analyst currently in training. We've kind of always got someone in training. We have one lab tech. Her job duties are to prepare reagents and perform quality assurance checks on those reagents and maintain our equipment to make sure that the stuff that we use is working as it should. And then we have 14 DNA analysts, many of whom wear multiple hats in terms of being an analyst or perhaps running a validation or being an analyst and participating in training. But we do have 14 full-time DNA analysts, DNA casework analysts. A little bit of a history of, oh, my animation is off. I'll just bring it all in. Okay, so a history of DNA analysis at OSP. In 1992, we started with non-PCR-based testing methods. These are historical testing methods. When you think back to like the OJ trial and they showed you those images of these bands on a piece of, on a transparency sheet, those are what's called non-PCR-based testing methods, meaning that those test methods didn't amplify or make lots of copies of the DNA like we do now. Rather, it kind of took the existing data and the existing DNA, and it may have chopped it up into a bunch of little pieces so we could analyze it by size. That testing was used here at the Oregon State Police from 1992 to 1999. In 1999, we replaced that type of testing, which was really consumptive. It required a lot of DNA to work. And we replaced it with PCR-based testing with the Profiler Plus and Cofiler amplification kits. These are the proprietary names for the chemistry that we used here in the lab to generate DNA profiles. And as I mentioned, that PCR-based, that means the process where we make lots and lots of copies of these target regions of DNA so that we can analyze them. In 2008, we transitioned to testing with the Identifiler kit. We used the exact same methods, the PCR-based methods, but instead of needing two separate tests in order to populate the CODIS database with a particular sample, we could now do all of the DNA profiling we needed with just a single kit or a single shot at the amplification step. In 2011, we transitioned to PCR-based testing with the Identifiler Plus kit. This looked at the same DNA locations as the kit used from 2008 to 2011, but it had some enhancements that made it better suited for mixture interpretation and better suited for samples that may be compromised in some other way. Then in 2017, we transitioned to the amplification system we're using now. It's called the Global Filer Kit. This kit analyzes 24 different locations, and the transition to this kit was actually mandated by the FBI to make the CODIS database a little bit more communicative when it came to international CODIS searches. So these three are considered legacy technologies for the purposes of this project and this presentation today. The testing we did with the Profiler Plus and Cofiler kits, the testing we did with the Identifiler kit, and the testing we did with the Identifiler Plus kit. And while these are all considered legacy technologies, the focus of our project is the data developed with these two kits. So basically the data we generated between 1999 and mid-2011 is the focus of the project we are going to be talking about today. Any questions on the history stuff? All right, so why aren't the technologies, the non-PCR based testing methods we used, considered legacy technologies? So we define legacy technologies according to the definition that's put out by the group that writes the standards that we follow. And so legacy technology, as far as that is concerned, is from a PCR-based method. And the reason that that's important is because the data generated before, back 1992 to 1999, is totally different. The data looks entirely different than the data we're generating now and the data we started to generate back at the end of 99 into 2000. And so we don't have any current procedures or currently trained analysts to do anything with that old data, to use it to reassess or to reinterpret that data. And the reason for this is that it's all about interpretation thresholds that were used here at OSP. So from 1999 to 2011, we used what we call a dual threshold for interpreting data, meaning that data that measured greater than 150 RFU, we used that for interpretation. And the data we saw between 50 and 150 RFU were in this gray area. And RFU is it's the unit of measurement that we use here in DNA. It's called a relative fluorescence unit. So if you think of a DNA profile, and I'm going to show you one here in a second, but if you think of a DNA profile as looking something like an EKG, where it's got sort of a line, and then the little blip that goes up, and then another line, the little blip that goes up, what we're looking for is how tall does that blip go up? That blip is our DNA data. And if it reaches 150 RFU or greater, then that data was used for interpretation. But if only reached 50 RFU, then we had a gray area approach that we took to it. And how we approached this data really evolved over time, over that time between 1999 and 2011. Initially, when we first adopted this type of analysis, that data wasn't used. We documented that we had the data, but we didn't draw conclusions from that data. Then, after a period of time, that data started to be used for exclusions. So we wouldn't include anybody in a DNA profile based on that data, but we would exclude people from a DNA profile based on that data. Then after a little bit more time, we would use that data for macro profile information. And what I mean by that is we might use that data to inform us about how many people do we think we have in this sample? Or is it reasonable to say that one of the people donating DNA to this sample is the victim from whom this sample was collected? So big picture information about the profile itself. Then a little bit later, we just started to use that data for interpretation purposes, but we still were not able to use it to calculate a statistic. And as you may know, in order to report an inclusion, we need to be able to calculate a statistic to that inclusion. And so if we can't use that data for a statistic, it's still limiting us in some way. And then as of today, as a part of this project, we are now using that data for all aspects of profile interpretation. All right, so here's an example. This is data that was generated in 2000. And so what you see is you see kind of a blue horizontal line. Do you guys see my mouse? I can never remember if you all see my mouse.
I cannot see your mouse, Marla.
Okay, thank you, Steph. All right, so if you look kind of in the middle of the page, we've got this flat line, and then that's kind of the EKG line. And then we've got a little 14 that's sticking up, and then two more little peaks, and then another peak that's sticking up. And so we're looking here at 3 different DNA locations. The numbers in the black boxes, the 14, the 15, the 16, and the 17, if you're looking from left to right, the numbers in those black boxes are the DNA types. And then underneath that, the numbers in those little red boxes, those are how tall those peaks are. Those are the relative fluorescence units, or RFU. And so what we would do is we would use a highlighter and we would highlight those heights that were in that gray area as kind of a reminder, like, hey, this is in the gray area. It's not really used for anything. And so what we can see in this particular sample is that we have one contributor contributing a lot more DNA than another contributor. We can see that the person who's contributing, let's start at location number 1, that 14 and that 17, those are about the same height. So in DNA profiling, that is where we would assign the DNA type of a 14-17 to that major contributor. And a major contributor is someone that's contributing more DNA. But what we see here is if we look at that 15 and that 16, that is additional DNA in this sample that we have detected, but we're not using that 15 and that 16 to draw any conclusions. Which means that when the DNA analyst moves through this profile and performs their interpretation, they will be able to identify the DNA type of the major contributor to this mixture as a 14-17 at location number 1, a 17-18 at location number 2, and a 23-25 at location number 3. And hopefully you guys can all see the 14 and the 17 are the 2 tallest peaks at location number 1. The 17 and the 18 at about 900 RFU, or 900 units tall, are the 2 tallest peaks at location number 2. And the 23-25 are the 2 tallest peaks at location number 3. But even though you all can see that data that's got the pink highlight by it, that 15 and 16, that 16 and 20, and that 19, when looking at this profile from left to right, no conclusions would be drawn from that data, meaning that data wouldn't be compared to anybody, that data wouldn't be used to calculate a statistic, and that data would not be loaded into the CODIS database. In 2021, though, what we're doing now with this project is that we are now using all of the detected peaks for interpretation and statistics, and potentially for CODIS. So what that means, obviously, there's no changes to the data itself. So that major contributor, they're staying the same with that genotype of a 14-17 at location number 1, a 17-18 location number 2, and a 23-25 at location number 3. But we now can develop a DNA profile for the minor contributor and use that for comparison purposes. So we can now say that the minor contributor to this DNA mixture at location number 1 has a 15-16 genotype. And the minor contributor at location number 2 in this DNA profile has a 16-20 genotype. And the minor contributor at location number 3 has to at least have a 19 in their DNA profile. As a refresher, you get half of your DNA from your mom and half of your DNA from your dad. So at any one location, you can have up to 2 DNA types. A 15 is a DNA type and a 16 is a DNA type. And here what we see at location number 3, because we're only seeing one piece of information from that minor contributor, we know they have to have a 19, but we don't know whether that 19 DNA type is all by itself. And so that person just has a 19. They got a double dose of a 19, one from mom and one from dad. Whether that 19 is, whether the other half of that DNA type is actually shared by the major contributor. So see how that 23 is a little bit taller than that 25? Maybe that minor contributor is a 19-23, and so the 23 in this DNA profile is getting a double dose from 2 separate contributors. We don't know what's happening, but we can be confident that the minor contributor at least has a 19. And this is a big improvement over we're not using this data at all. So why are we changing now? Well, why are we doing this? The original thresholds, they were put in place to be really super conservative. And when we say conservative, what we mean is that we are only using the absolute highest quality data to interpret and draw conclusions. And the reason for this is because we weren't like the only people starting to do DNA testing back in 2000. This type of technology was super new to the criminal justice system as a whole. And in terms of interpretation thresholds, labs, again, across the country were implementing these same types of interpretation guidelines, these dual threshold guidelines that were really designed to ensure, like I said, that the DNA data that we use to interpret and draw conclusions and associate people to crime scene evidence was absolutely only of the highest quality. But as with anything, over the years, our knowledge about forensic DNA analysis improved, as did the understanding of low-level DNA data. And that data between 50 and 150 relative fluorescence units tall, that data, that highlighted data in that gray area, that's low-level data. And as we got more experience with DNA testing, as the entire community got more experience with DNA testing, and there were more published articles in forensic journals about DNA testing, we really got to a place where we can much better understand what's going on with that low-level data. And this is science, right? This is science. When you start with something, models are consistent with industry standards and best practices, but those models, they get updated and they evolve over time so that best practices 20 years ago are different than best practices today. It's not really that much difference than that really cute outfit you wore to your best friend's wedding back in 2000, and you have now sworn her to not put those pictures on social media because you don't want anybody to see what you were wearing. That outfit was great at the time, but it's not current with your sort of best practice fashion sense of today. Everything changes over time. One thing to mention about our legacy statistics is that our current technology, the reports that are coming out of this section right now, use a likelihood ratio statistic. Many of you are familiar with that. We do not have the likelihood ratio capabilities for legacy data, and so our legacy statistics will be reported old school. I know at least one of you out there is like really excited about that because you don't like our legacy statistics. You don't maybe understand them as well as you understood the old statistics. But both of these approaches to statistical analysis are solid and they are rooted in scientific best practices. So what does a legacy statistic look like for a single source sample when you're going to see one of these legacy reassessment reports? It's going to read as the DNA profile obtained from this item matches the DNA profile of this person. The estimated probability of the DNA profile from a randomly selected individual matching this profile is 1 in 1.23 times 10 to the 13th power, or 12.3 trillion. We previously used a reporting cap of 10 billion, and so we would have previously reported this statistic as less than 1 in 10 billion. But we are now removing that cap and we are going to report the statistic as calculated. The legacy statistics that we are reporting for mixed samples will read as follows. Name is included as a contributor to this DNA mixture. The estimated probability of the DNA profile from a randomly selected individual being included in this DNA mixture is 1 in 567,000. I really want to emphasize here that we have transitioned for these legacy cases away from using the terminology cannot be excluded, and instead are reporting this as included. These have identical meanings. It means that this person who we've compared to this mixture looks like they could be in there. And then we provide a statistic for how likely that is to be a random occurrence. So what am I doing when I am doing a legacy reassessment? We are not doing any new lab work. I am doing all of this legacy reassessment from the comfort of my own office here. What this consists of is reviewing the work previously performed, reinterpreting that data, recomparing any standards or unknowns to that data, and then generating a new report. There are some updates, some improvements we're making in this new report. For starters, we're going to be a lot clearer about the sampling of the items of evidence. So exactly how much sample was taken from each item and where was it taken from. So back in 2000, we took kind of a summary approach to reporting DNA results. And so what we might do is generate a report that says the DNA profile from the shoe matches this person. But in reality, in the laboratory, we took a swab from the tongue of the shoe, we took a swab from the laces of the shoe, and we took a swab from the interior heel of the shoe, and we analyzed all three of those samples separately. And we got three kind of distinct DNA results from that. At the end of the day, the author of the original report took kind of the most complete answer, which was the result from the tongue, and reported that out, that the DNA profile obtained from the tongue of the shoe matches the DNA profile of this person. So that conclusion hasn't changed. We're just adding some additional detail about the other analysis that was done on the item and the associated DNA results. Another thing that we're doing is we are providing information about DNA extract disposition. A DNA extract is purified DNA in liquid form in a tiny little tube. I should have grabbed one for a visual, but I didn't. So it's in a tiny little tube, and that DNA can be used for additional testing. It can be used for additional testing here using 2017 technology, or it can be sent out to a private laboratory for additional testing or for forensic genealogy testing. It is totally different than remaining evidence. And what we're doing is we are providing information about the disposition of extracts that is tailored to the results of the legacy reassessment. So you'll see here under extract disposition, there's a little header that says where applicable, sperm cell and epithelial cell fractions are noted. When we get a sample into the laboratory that is thought to contain sperm or in which sperm have been observed, we take that DNA sample and we split it into two. We split it into an extract that's going to contain predominantly sperm cells, and then an extract that's going to contain everything else. And that allows us to really isolate the DNA profile from the individual who contributed the sperm to that sample for drawing more meaningful conclusions. And so because we have both types of extracts, a sperm extract and an epithelial cell extract, we're going to reference those extracts in this extract disposition section of our report. The statement you see here on your screen is that we have DNA extract from one or more exhibits retained here at the laboratory. And if there's an extract that we consider to be a good candidate for additional testing here at the laboratory, or maybe retesting of the original exhibit here at the OSP laboratory, we're going to highlight that in the report and ask you to give us a call so we can talk about it. If we have extracts that we don't necessarily, based on our legacy reinterpretation, that we don't think need any additional testing or warrant additional testing, we'll just let you know that we have them. And then we're going to also let you know the samples from which we don't have any DNA extract remaining. This could be because the original analyst used all of the available DNA extract in their testing, or it could be because the original analyst had leftover DNA extract that they disposed of because there was parent evidence to go back to. Our policy is that an extract needs to be retained if there's leftover, if there's no original sample to go back to. So if I have a set of 4 vaginal swabs and all 4 of those vaginal swabs have been consumed over the years in DNA testing, but I have a little bit of extract left, I'm going to keep that extract. But if I've only consumed 2 of 4 vaginal swabs and there are still 2 intact swabs remaining for testing, even if I have a little bit of extract left, we're not going to retain that extract. We're going to go back to those additional swabs should additional testing be warranted. There are situations in which the legacy review is going to find some extracts in our long-term storage that we no longer need to retain. It might be that the original analyst retained the extract from those 2 vaginal swabs when there were still 2 to go back to. And for storage and chain of custody reasons, we're not going to continue to retain those samples when we know we've got evidence to go back to. So you're going to see this statement on your report in that scenario. You may also see a statement, You may also see a statement that says DNA extracts from item of evidence not listed above may be retained by the laboratory. Those are going to be extracts that were generated using those non-PCR-based testing methods, so those really old school testing methods. Or for some of these cases that have really been ongoing and active over the years, we may have extract retained from analysis done 2 months ago. That analysis isn't subject to the legacy review, so those items aren't going to be described in the legacy report, but we may still have extract. And so we just want to let you know, like, just be aware, we've got some other stuff. Contact us if you need to. So what are some of the possible outcomes of this process, of this legacy reassessment process? So let's start with interpretation and statistics. The primary thing that we've been seeing happening overall with the cases we've done thus far is that oftentimes the number of contributors to a DNA sample may increase. So we've got this DNA profile. The original analyst didn't use the information in that gray area to draw any conclusions about the number of contributors to a sample. I'm looking at that profile in 2021. I'm now using that information. And so instead of proceeding with interpreting this profile as if there are only 2 DNA contributors, because I'm not using that data in the gray area, using that data now leads me down an interpretational path where there are at least 3 contributors to the DNA profile. So that's what's going to happen. Sometimes the number of contributors to a sample may go up. We're also seeing that previously uninterpretable profiles may become interpretable. And that's the example I shared below. Before, I don't know why I said below. That previously uninterpretable minor, we're now able to do something with it. We're interpreting that data and we are moving forward with it as best we can. The previously reported statistics will change. Even if there's no change in the profile and the interpretation at all, sometimes just removing that less than 1 to 10 billion cap is going to mean that a new number is going to be reported. Using more data in a statistic by adding in those peaks that were previously not used in statistical analysis, it may result in a bigger statistical estimate or a better stat. But sometimes when the number of contributors increases, that means that the data we have to use in a statistic goes down, which can result in a lower statistical analysis and estimate. And this is all because using those DNA types in that area that was previously the gray area, and using that, we can now apply them to the statistical calculation as appropriate. Sometimes what's going to happen, though, is that a previously interpretable profile may become uninterpretable, or a previously interpretable portion of a profile may become uninterpretable. So in practice, what that means is that a mixture that was previously interpreted as 2 contributors, having 1 major contributor and 1 minor contributor, when we move that profile into the 3 contributor pathway, we may not be able to do anything with that minor profile anymore. That minor profile might become uninterpretable and not suitable for use in an interpretation or a statistic. And sometimes by adding in this data, we render a profile as a whole not suitable for interpretation due to the limitations that we have for best practices of calculating mixture statistics. So when you increase the complexity of a mixture, sometimes you reach a point that you can no longer interpret that mixture or perform a statistic. As far as CODIS, sometimes a new profile is going to go into CODIS, which I think is great. Sometimes a profile status may change. A profile may move from state to national because we're now able to use more of that data. A profile may go from national to state. By adding that additional complexity into an interpretation, we may find that we can't be as declarative or certain in some of the DNA types we've interpreted, so we need to kind of pull it back a little bit. Sometimes you're going to see a profile being removed. This can be the result of a change in interpretation status, right? If a previously interpretable minor goes to uninterpretable, that minor can no longer be in the CODIS database. The other reason for profile removal is that, just like everything else, best practices related to CODIS eligibility have changed. And so a profile that may have been eligible historically may not meet the current standards for CODIS eligibility and may need to be removed. You may hear from us asking for additional detail, new reviews of old agency reports, just because we're trying to build the support in our case file as we have it today to support the continued inclusion of that profile in the database. One thing you may see in a legacy report is, so this top couple of sentences is that we've entered a profile into the DNA database to be searched against the state and national databases in an ongoing manner. And just to let you guys know, currently national level searches are happening daily. The entry replaces a previously entered profile for this exhibit. So as part of this legacy reassessment, we're sort of cleaning up those CODIS entries and taking out the old and putting in the new. And just like now, we will let you know if a match is identified. But the caveat is that future notifications may or may not include matches reported previously. And so if an offender match was previously obtained and a standard is submitted, we're not going to re-report the offender match. So if I have a cigarette butt profile that back in 2005 went into the database and hit to Joe Offender, and then y'all got us a standard from Joe Offender, that legacy reassessment report is going to assess that cigarette butt profile to the standard from Joe Offender. And so repeating the hit to Joe Offender's CODIS profile doesn't provide anybody any additional information. So we're not going to re-report that offender match. If a profile was removed from ENDIS down to ESTIS, we're not going to be able to re-report previous ENDIS matches because it's not being searched at the ENDIS level anymore. And there also exists the possibility that some forensic profiles, evidence profiles, or offenders, since the time of the original entry and search and today's entry and search, some of those profiles or offenders may have been removed from the database and aren't even in there to hit to the legacy case a second time. Speaking of CODIS, I would like to draw your attention to the DNA Index of Special Concern. Our laboratory issued a notification letter through Lois in November of last year. And what this is that this is an index that contains DNA profiles that are searched in real time against individuals arrested in other states. So the premise is that in a state that has arrestee legislation, so a state that routinely collects DNA samples from individuals arrested of a crime, the idea is that that individual's DNA profile will be generated real quick there while they're in the booking station, uploaded to the database so that it can be quick searched against any forensic profiles that are in this DNA Index of Special Concern, and perhaps a match can be obtained while that individual is still in custody at that booking station. So any legacy reassessment profiles we're going to consider for this index as appropriate. There are some quality measures that need to be taken. It also needs to be certain crime types. But our alternate CODIS administrator, Kyle Mitchell, put together a really great video at the link that you see here. And as I said, we're recording this meeting and we'll be able to distribute it later. So you don't have to furiously write it down. You should get notification of the recording. Some other sort of side outcomes of legacy reassessment. One thing that I really like about this is that we are providing one single report that covers all of the analysis performed prior to 2017, and then comparisons to any standards submitted later. So many of these cases have been through multiple rounds of submission and triage and more submission and more triage, and the DNA results are summarized in 5 or 6 DNA reports. This really gives us an opportunity to put all of that DNA information from the historical analyses into a single DNA report that I think is really going to help with triage and questions about case status. Occasionally, we're going to come across a report that doesn't have any changes at all. And so what you're going to see in that scenario is a statement in the report that states the previous DNA analysis performed in this case has undergone review by a qualified analyst to ensure it conforms to current best practices and requirements regarding profile interpretation, statistical calculations, and reporting. All current expectations are met. No further action has been taken. So what that means is that we're not going to reinvent the wheel, and we're not going to repeat every previous analysis done. We're just saying that everything that was done already, we checked it, and it meets all current best practices. But these cases may list the extracts retained at the laboratory to assist with future triage and testing questions. So you'll see this little blurb here, and then that extract disposition section of the report just underneath. I do want to draw your attention to the fact that due to changes in our internal policy based on information from the FBI's legal team, previously reported comparisons to convicted offender samples will not be repeated. We sent out a letter in 2015 regarding this, but what you'll see in the report is that due to current Oregon State Police policies on the use of profiles in the CODIS database, comparisons to these individuals were not repeated. Should comparisons be necessary, please submit an oral swab DNA standard from each of these individuals. And so if you need a report, like a contemporary report that says this offender is excluded, we cannot do that without a standard. Or this offender is included, we cannot do that without a standard. We are requesting that new evidence submissions be held until legacy reassessment has been performed. As you can imagine, because of the increased use of the data, we are getting new profiles into CODIS, and so maybe reanalysis of items isn't necessary. We're able to draw conclusions to things we weren't previously, so maybe we don't need to analyze that item of evidence again. So until the legacy reassessment has been completed, we are requesting that new evidence submissions be held. Once that reassessment has been performed, if this is a case that needs additional triage, we're going to try to set up a meeting, a virtual meeting where we have a DNA analyst and a member of the biology team so that we can strategize the next best steps for new submissions on these legacy cases. We do have a genealogy policy that I just wanted to remind you all of. It's in a notification letter from March of 2019. And what that policy states in a nutshell is that we can release the profiles that we have. We can release the extracts that we have, including a step where we perform what's called DNA quantitation, or this step where we see how much DNA do we have and how much of it is male. And so we can perform that. Oftentimes, if you're looking to submit a DNA extract to a private laboratory for genealogy, they need that information. But our current policy is that we will not perform a new extraction just to submit something to a private laboratory. And as with all work at a private laboratory, we are not able to take any of their resulting data and enter it into the CODIS database. So that was a lot of information. Here you have my email address and direct line. Note that I am still currently teleworking a couple of days a week as my kids are still in school. And so sometimes email is best for me. I also have Stephanie's contact information here. That's her email address and her direct line here at the laboratory. I would love to hear your questions. No questions? All right. I once had a colleague tell me that when you end a presentation and there are no questions, it just means that there's thunderous applause going on in the background. So I'm going to go with that. If something comes up later, obviously reach out to Stephanie, reach out to me by phone or by email. We are happy to talk through the specifics of this program or talk through any of the cases that have already gone through a legacy reassessment. But with that, I will stop recording. I'll stop recording and then I'll stay on for a minute in case you don't want to ask your question on the recording.